Joining me for another installment of 17th century history is a man who should need no introduction, William Keyte.
Good to be on. Thank you very much, Damien. It's a privilege once again. Apologies for the rather bright light behind me, but I think that will improve shortly. Yeah, good to see you. It's been deep reading for you, I suspect, as well as me. Um, yeah, the Glorious Revolution is a big is a big topic, and the Bill of Rights, and it's been a bit of a surprise. I don't know about you, but you don't have to scratch very far below the surface to discover things are not quite as they seem.
We've decided to bring it forward, haven't we? So we've skipped Cromwell and
Yes.
the interregnum, and we've skipped Charles II.
Oh, why have we done that? We've done it, I suppose, because this chapter, the end of the 17th century, is the most contentious. It's the most contentious constitutionally, as we're finding. And historically, it's also outrageous. There's all sorts of stuff hiding below the surface that, interestingly, not just the mainstream are quite happy to sort of leave that deception in place, but quite large portions of the freedom movement are quite happy to leave that deception in place as well, which is extraordinary. I think. So we're going to be uncovering some quite interesting stuff, aren't we? I think.
The whole point is to try and get to the facts and to the truth and anything that's been missed. What I wanted to get into first, Will, is basically what we've just spoke about,
Yeah.
in the sense that the history is a little bit distorted. And it
Yes.
wasn't until the mid 1900s that people started to challenge the mainstream narrative of what happened during the Glorious Revolution. This is a quote from the Revolution of 1688, 89. Most important among them was Lord Macaulay, who more than anyone else determined how historians and the educated public understood the revolution up to the middle of the 20th century.
Mm.
Confining his attention largely to England and to constitutional and political issues, Macaulay painted the revolution's leaders in black and white terms, portraying King James II as a villain, the friend of Roman Catholicism, political absolutism, and French and papal power, and the enemy of Protestants. He depicted Prince William of Orange as a hero, a selfless champion of Protestantism, parliamentary government, and political freedoms, a deliverer who, accepting the invitation of the nation's immortal seven, themselves selfless in their concerns, came to England only to rescue the nation's religion, laws, and liberties. Reluctantly accepting the crown, the prince agreed to the Declaration of Rights as a condition of his being made king, and thereby entered the contract with the people to uphold their rights.
It sounds wonderful, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
It sounds, in fact, it sounds glorious. Yeah. So absolutely. So this is what and remarkably, it doesn't take much. I mean, actually, even on the surface, when you start to look at the Glorious Revolution, and everything that surrounds it, even just on the surface, it looks a bit wrong. There's something not quite right. But actually, as soon as you start to scratch below the surface, it becomes pretty evident very quickly, that this is quite manufactured. There's a very slanted, well, that's a bit kind, just say that it's a bit slanted. And this is what I think is important for us to uncover in this. That's our aim, isn't it? In this, what I've got is a blank page, because I might just pull some quotations and references across every now and again, just to. But I thought it might be good actually just to mention, and I know that we've got a lot of sources in this, haven't we, Damien? You've been
Yeah.
reading some of the same stuff that I've been reading and some different things, and I've been reading some different things. But just to share some of that, we've just been talking about this online essay, which I guess we can share, can't we?
Yeah.
By a guy called Dennis Barton. There's 4 parts to it, and it's in fact, if I go into page 1 of it, here it is. The Church in History is the website. James II and the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Dennis Barton. And it's really good because it's got, good, here's your contents, and it's going through all the sort of the claims, if you like, and the common claims that are made in the official version of history about the Glorious Revolution. And he practically addresses everything that you could want very clearly. So it's a really good place to start in this. So I'm going to be making reference to that. In fact, if I stop share just for a moment, I've also been reading, and so have you, Damien, haven't you? The Anglo-Dutch Moment,
Yes.
by Jonathan Israel, which is a collection of essays. It's not a small book. And I've only managed to read some of it and to get into some of the most important bits. I've also been dipping into this book, The Glorious Revolution by Evelyn Cruikshanks. And what is interesting about some of these books, and I'll share my screen again in a minute, is that I suppose since about the 50s, when there was an author called Pinkham, I think is the surname, who got an awful lot of grief. Lucille Pinkham, yeah, who dug up a lot of this information about what was really going on around the Glorious Revolution, and she got all kinds of grief because she was the first one to do it. By the time we got to the 1970s, and then we got to the tercentenary, the sort of 300-year celebration of the Glorious Revolution in 1988, that's when things got quite interesting. And what was interesting about that was that the Glorious Revolution, people were quite keen to celebrate it, probably almost more than in Britain, because in Britain we were being a little bit coy about that. Why? Because I think many people in the academic establishment, particularly the history academic establishment, were going to be a bit concerned about what a new focus on the Glorious Revolution was actually going to reveal. And so actually the 300-year anniversary of it was quite a good moment, in fact, because that's exactly what happened, is that it brought up a whole crop of authors who started to re-look at this subject, and yes, indeed, started to bring up all sorts of evidence as to the fact that we've been sown a fast one here, that the Glorious Revolution is not at all glorious. It's not at all how we've been led it to believe. So if I just share the screen again, and what I'll do is I'll just throw some interesting quotations into this. So here's the first one, and I'll just paste it across into here. So here's Evelyn Cruikshanks, The Glorious Revolution. In her introduction, page 2, she asks the question, was the revolution a selfless act on the part of the Prince of Orange to restore the British liberties after the encroachments of an absolutist James? Was it a Dutch conquest? Was it achieved by what might be termed the most successful confidence trick in British history? One thing is certain. William of Orange, or I've mistyped that, I think that's meant to be did not come over to England by popular demand. The thick smokescreen, which became the Whig interpretation, was put up very quickly to mask what had really happened. Yet doubt remained, is that Blair Warden could write, the deposition of James II left the English with a guilty conscience, which they have never shaken off. Going back to how we don't really want to talk about this too much because we've got a guilty conscience about what actually happened. And so people actually at the time following the Glorious Revolution, even those that actually benefited from it, were sort of starting to look back and think, my God, what have we just been through? What on earth happened there? and that was my thinking of it. That's certainly an understatement. Um, one or two other things, just very quickly, because I think these are quite interesting. Let's get rid of that one and paste that one in there instead. Again, this is the same. Oh, that's interesting. Not sure why that's come up there. Oh, there we go. 1988 was the tercentenary celebration of the Glorious Revolution, which brought about a rather coy re-examination of the events. Evelyn Cruikshanks credits Jonathan Israel in particular, who is the author of the big book that I talked about, who thought that it had been one of the most inglorious revolutions. Another thing that's interesting to consider is Tom Paine, who, of course, now this was a lot later on, this was 1791 when he wrote the Reflections, supported the American and French revolutions, but he felt that William III's invasion had enslaved the people no less than William the Conqueror in 1066. All right, okay, so and I could put more up, but I'm not going to now. I think that's enough for the moment. But as a sort of by way of my introduction, there's a few little bits and pieces that I think might be quite interesting carrying on from your slides.
Tom Paine, he wasn't a big fan of the Bill of Rights either, was he?
No, and we'll I guess we'll get into that. I mean, I don't know about you, but I suspect probably what we'll do is divide this up as mostly the lead up to the Glorious Revolution in this part.
Yeah.
But we might be tempted to drop the old bombshell later. We'll see how we go.
Well, I've done a couple of slides covering some of the background stuff that you're probably going to want to elaborate on, Will.
Yeah, okay, brilliant.
James II married Mary of Modena, who was Roman Catholic. And there was already suspicions that James had already converted to Catholicism by this time, as he stopped taking Anglican communion in 1672. The Test Act was passed in 1673. To hold any office, political, military, religious, meant you had to take an oath of allegiance and receive the sacrament of communion in the Anglican Church. It was a declaration rejecting the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. Extended to peers in 1678, James II refused to take the Test Act oath, which implied he was Catholic and believed in Catholic Church teachings.
To break that down, he was going Catholic. He was beginning to feel that the Roman Catholicism was the real Christianity, the real church, and the establishment in England was getting very nervous and hot under the collar about this. Really, wasn't it? And we'll find this later, that this issue was the thing that was used against James II, probably more than anything else. Although there were plenty of other things that we'll get into, but this issue in particular was that James II was basically wanting to take the country Catholic, and this is what the whole thing was really about, wasn't it?
In 1677, James's daughter Mary married William of Orange. And I've just put in brackets because I thought that was interesting, and I know it went on at that time. William and Mary were actually first cousins.
Probably quite normal back then.
In 1678, Titus Oates fabricated the Popish plot. His story suggested Catholics were secretly plotting to assassinate Charles II. This caused anti-Catholic hysteria, and many innocent Catholics were executed based on his testimonies.
Yeah, these were really elaborate stories, weren't they? Titus Oates was a nutter. I mean, just to give people a bit of a background behind that, this guy was not credible. He spent most of his life. I think he actually did get an ordination in the church, but he was then kicked out of practically every job that he was in, or every community that he joined, every religious community, for behaving just abominably, I think. I mean, it's almost comical to read about his background, but what isn't comical is that this guy spun all kinds of yarns about the situation in England at the time and about what James was trying to do. And once people started to look into it, it turned out to be just absolute rubbish, wasn't it? Titus Oates was a big cause of disinformation and deceptions generally, in fact.
I think I think there was like 30 to 35 people who were executed on them testimonies.
Whilst it's kind of comical when you start to read about his life and what he was doing, you realize actually there were very serious implications about his disinformation and the lies that he was spinning generally. It was nasty. Nasty implications, definitely. Yeah.
In 1679, Parliament attempted to pass legislation that would remove James from the hereditary line of succession and stop him taking the throne. This is better known as the Exclusion Crisis. Charles dissolved Parliament before this could happen. But it was actually likely that it would have happened if Charles hadn't have dissolved Parliament. In 1685, Charles II died and James II succeeded him. In the same year, Charles's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth, attempted to overthrow James but was defeated at the Battle of Sedgemoor. This led to the bloody assizes and the eventual execution of the Duke for treason.
James was heavily criticised by the Whigs as part of the propaganda for the way that he sort of dealt with the dissenters. But there's not actually that good evidence for it. You know, mostly it seems that the orders that were given to sort of round up the perpetrators, if you like, were actually probably to put them on trial. Although it was standard at the time that anyone involved in you know, any kind of rebellion like that would actually be executed for that. That was quite standard stuff going on. But some will have certainly have been hanged, as was, as I say, the legal position, and it was normal at the time. The Whigs claimed that the massacres led to the West Country of England turning against James, which is pretty untrue because, you know, only a year later, I think he was very well received when he toured the West Country.
Yeah.
30 years later, I think, after the Glorious Revolution, it was the West Country was an absolute sort of hotbed of enthusiasm for the return of for the return any return of the Jacobites, you know. So yeah, I think it was, you know, there's a lot of disinformation again about this. Many of the rebels, James commuted their penalty rather than to be executed to serve, actually instead to servitude in America for 10 years, I think it was. At the time, there was a lot of propaganda that was put out. Pamphlets were circulated a little bit later, actually, around the time of, you know, 1688-9, which were sponsored by, guess who? Titus Oates again, who was the one, of course, who invented the Popish plot. So we're already seeing a lot of, yeah, smoke and mirrors and shifting sands going on.
In the first session of Parliament, James wanted to lift restrictions on all dissenters and challenged the existing penal laws, but Parliament resisted and wanted even more oppressive measures put on dissenters. James prorogued this session of Parliament. In 1687, unable to reach any agreements, James eventually dissolved Parliament and issued the Declaration of Indulgence, which suspended the Test Act and granted religious toleration to all dissenters, freedom of conscience.
So that's a key theme, isn't it, really? This is what we see more and more, in fact, when you start to scratch below the surface of all of this, is that you see that James II was really about civil rights. He was about religious toleration. That's what he wanted, which is ironic, isn't it? Because of the claims that are often made about the glorious revolution and what a wonderful thing it brought about. And yet actually what this was really about was deposing a king who actually was already about this. And I can talk a little bit more about that in a moment when you think it's appropriate, just a little bit more about the background of what James II was fighting for, what he was trying to uphold in the way of values?
In 1688, 7 bishops petitioned the king regarding his declaration of indulgence and refused to read it in church. They were arrested and thrown into prison on charges of seditious libel. John Somers defends the bishops in court and they are found not guilty and released. What I found interesting about that 7 bishops was that later on, 5 of the bishops refused to recognize William as
Yes,
the king. And this is another massive thing, is that a bit later on, Mary of Modena gives birth to a legitimate male heir, James Francis Edward Stuart. So the threat of a Catholic dynasty is definitely on now.
yeah. So that was the problem for a long time, wasn't it? That it was increasingly looking like James having an heir there wasn't one. It wasn't going to happen, and then this was quite near the sort of last minute, wasn't it?
This to me is what kind of sparked William into action as well, because obviously a male heir is going to threaten Mary's position of being next in line,
Yeah,
which is going to threaten his plans to invade
absolutely.
England
Yeah,
and have some sort of claim on the throne himself, which he didn't have. James II was an advocate for religious toleration and freedom of conscience, use of the prerogative to suspend the Test Act. So just to recap, Will, he was well within his rights to suspend that.
absolutely right. Yeah, just well, you carry on because I might just add a few bits to that. But yes, totally. Yeah.
This is an absolute blinder. One of James's closest friends and assistants was the Quaker William Penn. Penn was a firm believer in individual rights and trial by jury.
Yes. Yeah. So the famous case in 1670, Bushel's case, with the plaque on the wall in the Old Bailey. That is the Penn and Mead case, because William Penn basically was preaching, wasn't he? And he later became the founder of the state of Pennsylvania in America, following, interestingly, James II's assistance in that to found a community based on individual rights in America. So everything that we understand to be constitutional and all about the principle of individual rights. This was the Bushel's case of William Penn that was just founding the rights of jury independence in trial by jury. The people themselves of the country being the final arbiter of law. This was brought about by the likes of people like William Penn. And an inconvenient truth in this regard is that William Penn himself was best mates with James II, not William III and his crew that came in. It was James II who was all about trying to was coming to a greater understanding of the importance of trial by jury, no doubt, being that friend of William Penn. Now, if that's not one of the greatest ironies, I don't know, and sort of inconvenient truths about this, I don't know what is, frankly. End of rant.
It's trying to understand where the connection is, where the friendship would grow if James was this immoral
Yes,
religious tyrant that was trying to impose Catholicism on the nation. It just doesn't add up, does it?
it doesn't. So, when you look at somebody and you look at their behaviors, you look at the reports and you start to get into the detail, that's one thing. But when you start seeing who are they associating with, who are they aligning with, that's another indication that James II was a good man.
I started looking at the Immortal Seven and the character of the Immortal Seven, and it's not too good, to be honest.
So we should explain just briefly what the Immortal Seven is then, just to give the background behind that.
The Immortal
We'll do that.
Seven were supposedly the ones who writ the letter of invitation to William of Orange to intervene.
So some would say the plotters.
It's not put like that, but what's
No.
interesting when you like scratch beneath the surface is that it wasn't actually the Immortal Seven who requested. Well, it wasn't them who they put the letter together, but it was at the request of William. It wasn't as if it happened organically and they writ this letter and they were, pleading with William of Orange to come and save the country. It was the other way round. William
Yeah.
could see that the nation are going to see this as an invasion and
Yes.
requested that letter of invitation to legitimize his own conquest, basically, of England.
We'll end up
There's,
hinting, too much as to the real reasons as to why the Immortal Seven actually wanted the Glorious Revolution to take place and the Bill of Rights and all the rest of it. But
yeah.
there's no question that of all of them, most of them benefited from the revolution. It absolutely in intended ways. They knew that this was going to be the case, but we won't get into that at this stage too much.
Upon taking the throne in 1685, James emptied the prisons of all religious dissenters. Another example of his stance. James
Absolutely.
II's reign was free from executions due to religious belief, a first for over 150 years. James pardoned and even employed Monmouth rebels that had taken up arms against him.
Yeah, there's some evidence that he was trying to bring them to round them up for trial rather than just,
Yeah.
executing them.
James is often depicted as a tyrannical king who believed in the divine right of kings. The principle of government or head of state being appointed by divine right is heavily rejected in Catholicism and by the Catholic Church. So this doctrine is more Anglican
Yes. It's a bit of an irony, isn't it?
because the king obviously becomes head of the church rather than the Pope.
Let's just take one or two things here that just give a flavour of. So this is quite interesting quotation from a book, James II by F.C. Turner, but this is actually quoted in Dennis Barton's essay behind, which I talked about earlier. So an example of his reformist social policies, because he was a moral man, can be seen
Yeah.
in his laws regarding marriage, for example. James issued a decree to regulate wedding procedure so as to end clandestine marriages, especially of minors, and to prevent men committing bigamy. Yeah, the men who overthrow him ultimately in the Glorious Revolution annulled this reform,
Oh dear.
and it was not reintroduced until 1753 in the Hardwicke Marriage Act. So that's just one example of where James II was trying to bring about social reforms that were morally based, where those that were trying to depose him were kind of trying to do the complete opposite. Yeah, there were all sorts of accusations that the guy James II was either incompetent or he was selfish, which is not true. So we could look at a few other things. I'll just mention them. Nothing on screen here. So naval incompetence as command. We probably come on to this later when we get into the invasion, but it's often thrown that he was incompetent in sort of a military capacity, but that's not true.
He served in the Spanish Navy, didn't he?
Yes,
As an
yeah,
officer.
absolutely. And as commander of the fleet, Navy, often discussing tactics with his captains, introducing new techniques to increase team spirit and morale, modern techniques, which are now often attributed to James II. Interestingly, he often took huge risks in fighting by staying closest to the most dangerous places of action. Yeah, he came close to getting killed himself on a number of occasions, which actually this was in sort of slightly earlier time in Charles II's time, his elder brother.
Yeah.
He had insisted, this is Charles II, had insisted that he should not lead the navy into battle in the future because he had this tendency to get right in there, get stuck in the fighting with all his, his leading men.
Which proves that he wasn't really a coward.
Which again, you're right, is often thrown as well as an accusation. So Fortescue, the greatest army historian, it caused him to write regarding James. Let's just pull this one across, actually, might as well. So let's replace that. It is not too much to say that his expulsion, that is James II's expulsion eventually, in this respect, was the greatest misfortune that ever befell the army. Yeah. So military writers regard James II as a brave man, as a I don't know about a hero, but someone who was had great qualities. We could talk about just commerce very quickly as well. When he returned from exile, it's often been accused that he was of this incompetence, but actually in commerce as well. When he returned from exile in 1660, he founded the Royal Africa Company. Later invested in and supported several trading companies in the East Indies, Turkey, Hamburg, the Canary Islands. Became governor of the Hudson Bay Company. We're getting into kind of commerce and stuff, but he was very efficient and quickly sent the Navy to recapture trading posts, for example, that were lost during Cromwell's period. Yeah, so he's doing some good stuff here. His electoral program in 1688 included the partial abolition of imprisonment for debt. So
Wow.
people, when people had debt, they were imprisoned. With his overthrow, that is the overthrow of James II, this reform was not introduced. He wasn't able to do it. And in 1729, later, jailers were still torturing debtors to death. Basically, yeah, James II was trying to introduce a little bit more, compassion, if you like, for people who were, even people actually who were actually his op political opposition. He was trying to go easy on people a little bit and be moral. But particularly when it came to social reform, he was certainly reviewing things. Another interesting thing about Negro slaves in the British colonies, which were not allowed to receive baptism. Yeah, and the reason why that was important because baptism would basically have been a public recognition of their full humanity. So if you were not baptized, then you would have run the risk of not being able to have religious education, no recognition of the unity of marriages, which would have then meant, for example, that you would have been prevented from being separated when being sold as slaves. Yeah, and so James II was trying to put a stop to this kind of stuff. Stated that he was going to insist that Negroes should be baptized, and he condemned their masters. Unfortunately, he was deposed in the Glorious Revolution before being able to put this policy into law. So he was, yeah, again, trying to alleviate the awful conditions of slavery. Probably wouldn't have been able to go as far as abolishing it, but he was trying to get there. He was trying to sort it out. It just starts to paint the picture that actually this guy was a moral guy. He was trying to put changes in place. So I'll stop sharing at that point. But yeah, that was just a little bit of background behind what he was trying to do. But why, that this kind of this Whig propaganda was trying to paint him as either a tyrant. He was trying to bring Catholicism to the nation. He was inconsiderate. He was incompetent. He was, all these claims were being made. But it's quite this essay of Dennis Barton's quite good. It detailed going through referencing other references, other historians, and demonstrating that that wasn't the case. So I just thought I'd paint that picture.
Also, well, Catholics in England at that time made up less than 15% of the country.
Yes,
It was a very, very small portion
it's
of
very
people.
small proportion. Yeah,
To say that he was going to be able to impose Catholicism is just nonsense, isn't it,
it's
really?
absolutely ludicrous. And he knew that that was the case, that he was going to be able to. Really, what he was interested in doing was leveling the playing field a bit more, because the persecution against, non-Anglicans was pretty awful. And yeah, I mean, we're getting towards the Test Act, aren't we? A bit more in a
Yeah,
bit more detail as to what that was really about. Basically, barring not any non-Anglicans. So it's not just Catholics. That would have been Presbyterians, Quakers. Um, it barred non-Anglicans from positions in government, from the armed forces. It barred non-Anglicans from protection of persecution laws.
yeah.
And he was trying to put an end to this.
You can't look at that as a moral in any way, can you? William of Orange was actually a Calvinist.
Exactly.
So he would have been part of that group of
It,
non-dissenters. Yet he took
it,
the throne.
yeah,
It's madness, isn't it?
it's absolute
Because
madness. The
if
hypocrisy.
if he wasn't who he was and he was just residing in England, he'd be being persecuted, wouldn't he?
Yeah, and James II was trying to put an end to that. It's
Yeah,
just
it's
extraordinary. Um, the Habeas Corpus Act was this idea that it was about bringing prisoners before court. You couldn't jail somebody without bringing them before court to get a ruling that this was legitimate, that it was
yeah,
legit, and that's good. That's great. The problem was that the Habeas Corpus Act also didn't allow James, who wanted to suspend the act in certain situations, because in order to carry out his duty of protecting the nation from political plots and insurrections, which
yeah,
which is quite obvious what was going on. And so the king couldn't. He couldn't. I think. I mean, obviously in the with the Monmouth rebellion was a perfect example, where the Duke of Monmouth proclaimed himself king in 1685, raised an army in the West Country, and we've already talked about this because it was put down at the Battle of Sedgemoor. But at the time, James could not make preventative arrests because of that was more because of the Test
yeah.
Act, though, wasn't it? Actually, but it was a similar issue to do with why um, he needed to suspend the Habeas Corpus Act as well and be able to do that. But anyway, that was another example of that where he was trying to, sort of be true to his duty, if you like, in the rule of law, but he couldn't do it because legislation was in place preventing him from doing it. So, yeah.
Do you know where preparations for that rebellion were made?
No, I probably read about it, but go on. Can't
Holland.
remember. Oh, right. Okay. No, right. Brilliant.
It's safe to
Yeah.
say that William of Orange and the States General and everybody else, the Dutch government, knew what was going on.
Right. Okay. It was a bit embarrassing, wasn't it? Being family. What we're beginning to find out, that it was all kinds of instigators that were involved in this. And, to what extent was William III a pawn in this? Maybe, and probably had massive regrets as well at various points. But there was certainly manipulation behind the scenes. It wasn't all William III. This was
No,
nothing like that, as we begin to discover. This was about all kinds of messing around behind the scenes by people who, well, we'll begin to discover this, that had all kinds of agendas.
I've got a couple of quotes here, Will,
Brilliant.
from some books that I've read, just about James, really. So James's virtues, honesty and plain speaking, the trust which he put in his servants, consistency, sincerity, and openness of purpose. He was ill-equipped, which ill-equipped him for the political world which he inherited.
Yeah, that's something that we could expand on, actually, because it's probably sounding already as though Damien and Will are romanticizing about James II's reign, um, as if it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Well, it was positive. There's no question. It would have been positive if he had been left to do what he was trying to do. But what we don't want to do is to be is always to come across, I suppose, as and it's quite hard not to. Actually, the more evidence you dig up, the more you realise
Yeah.
actually James II was a pretty good king. Actually, if we're going to pick holes, he was a little bit idealistic, um, a bit like Damien and Will. Which and the problem with that is that you're a little bit unpragmatic, and unlike his elder brother Charles II, who might have been a little bit of a compromiser. Now, is that savvy, or is that sort of suspending your principles a bit? It's actually very difficult
Yeah.
to travel that path. But the thing about James is that he was so principled in many ways that he was possibly a little naive in the way that he was going to deal with groups of people politically. And so he got himself possibly into difficult situations. He was quite smart, but he was very principled, wasn't he? He just decided, no, I can see straight away that that's just immoral. That's wrong,
Yeah.
and that's the way I see it. And so he might have come across as a bit in I always forget this word, intransigent.
He wasn't prepared to play the games that Charles was playing. He was happy to outmaneuver sneaky politicians with his own sneaky moves, whereas
Yes,
James just wanted to probably call it out and deal with it. Straight talking, as it says.
yes, good. He was a straight talker. He wasn't prepared to play the game, I think, really.
This second quote, unfortunately, few of his subjects could ever credit him with possessing such virtues. These were generally held to be incompatible with the principles of his Catholic religion. They attributed to James's the characteristics which a century of Protestant indoctrination led them to expect. Calculated faithlessness, the belief that any method was justified if it advanced the interests of Catholicism, cruelty, and a realness to submit to dictation by the Catholic clergy.
Readiness. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Extraordinary.
So because he was a Catholic, it wasn't possible that he had good intentions, basically.
Yeah, I know exactly. He was just label him a Catholic, and then what that's going to do then is just make him a villain.
Even if he tried to do something good, it was
Not,
perceived as trying to advance Catholicism.
yeah, and largely that would have been because of this background manipulation that was going on, and disinformation. A lot of stirring. Um, yeah, awful actually.
So
Terrible time.
he disliked Charles' acceptance of conditional loyalty, his cynical tolerance of the blatant opportunism of ministers playing a double game, and his risky dependence on being able to outwit even the cleverest and most unscrupulous politicians. Unlike Charles, James would not disguise his real thoughts and feelings, tolerate dishonesty or time servers, sacrifice loyal servants, or allow innocent men to be punished. As far as what he was trying to achieve, I think one author was saying that we can't not look at it as if he wasn't trying to be moral in his actions.
Yeah,
It's quite difficult to say that it was calculated. Everything was calculated. These quotes were from The Revolution of England, 1688, and this is an author, J.R. Jones. That was James. I also had a deeper look into William Penn. So believe it or not, early William Penn, he was a little bit anti-Catholic. He held some mild, and I say mild because it was as far as 17th century goes, anti-Catholic views He wrote pamphlets condemning popery and even bought into the popish plot. He suggested that an affirmation should replace the oath of the Test Act, which was equally oppressive towards Catholics. James and William Penn were still close, were still able to deal with each other.
What that indicates is two people who are actually quite mature, because what seems to happen mostly around this time, and it's still happening now as well, as I've been ranting about recently, is that people who are if you're being manipulated, if you're being easily manipulated psychologically, one of the signs of that is being taken into prejudicial extremes. So you take a view on something that is just a little bit over the top, a bit complete. All of these people must go to prison, or it's like
Yeah,
it's just a bit sort of cartoonish, a bit immature, because you're lacking nuance. You're lacking the understanding that complexity is okay in issues. We need to thrash this out. We need to come to an understanding, and that means looking at complexity and nuance. And obviously these two were able to do that, and not just joining sides, not taking a view on a sort of the basis of a group, which
yeah.
is what's happening a lot at the moment as well. And so this is good. I mean, it's a sign of two people who are in opposing views about something, but they come together and they discuss it and they think about it, and obviously became quite close, and realized that where they come together, the areas they come together, those are the most important things, which is things like civil liberty and individual rights and trial by jury.
William Penn, an advocate for authentic trial by jury and jury independence, wrote about the three fundamental rights of Englishmen: a right to property, a right in the making of laws, and a right to be judged by one's peers, a champion for liberty and peace.
Yeah, and the key one there is the making of laws. Well, you see, unlike the intellectual background and framing of the Glorious Revolution on William III's side, who was really probably John Locke. And people will be surprised at that, because John Locke often is read, with his treatises on government. And if you actually read it, what is quite interesting is that although he understands that, private property is important, he comes up with a lot of good stuff. But where does John Locke fall down on? He falls down on the greater good, which
Yeah,
is the kind of thing that people miss, right? If you've got somebody who's saying, no, individuals must give up their individuality and their sovereignty for the greater good, what do you have there? You have a collectivist.
yeah,
And so what we're beginning to expose here is that the impetus behind the Glorious Revolution is fundamentally collectivist. That's what it is, and that's why it brought about parliamentary sovereignty, and which is all about voting in elections. It's about approximating laws, not making law individual based on an individual situation through trial by jury. Not that
no,
at all. What we're going to do is approximate laws through statute. That's what the Bill of Rights and the Glorious Revolution was laying the foundations for, was a collectivist government, essentially. But on the surface, we were all tricked by the idea that we can vote in elections.
yeah,
Fantastic. We'll all have adult suffrage. But what William Penn and James II understood is that you don't deal with justice like that through the threat of punishment, through approximation of your laws, by putting in loads and loads of statute. That's just order following. What we're really looking for here is trial by jury, where you take an individual situation and you balance the rights of each individual problem based on the views and the discernment of those around you in your community. And they got it. They understood it. And that was the true rule of law, which harks back to Magna Carta. But what was being put in place here with the Glorious Revolution and the Bill of Rights was basically an inversion of that, turning that upside down, talking about the greater good. And that's the error, if you like, in John Locke's thinking, is that you are basically surrendering individual rights at that point.
It fundamentally brought about the rise of political parties.
Everything that the Bill of Rights and the Glorious Revolution was putting in place was that it was cementing in place and facilitating and legitimizing the power of Parliament, which basically is about adult suffrage and a proclamation of laws and therefore your rights. It's passing the right of who determines your rights to an authority of government, rather than Magna Carta, which was basically saying no, government doesn't have the right to do that. What the Magna Carta was saying was that the government's only purpose is to facilitate the people to judge the laws themselves. That's the difference. And so we're heading into a bad place, really, with the Glorious Revolution and the Bill of Rights. That's what it was putting in place. And people have missed this. They've not understood it, and they certainly don't understand it in the mainstream world. But we've got huge swathes of the freedom movement as well, and other constitutional commentators who have not understood this. You say that you believe in natural justice and individual rights and equity, meaning in the natural sense, in the broad sense. I'm not talking about the law of equity that was put in place by the government. I'm not talking about that. And when I use the word equity, what I'm talking about is that we're all equal under the law. We're all subject to the same set of standards. Well, the only way that you can have a system, or really it's the absence of a system actually, where you're all equal under the law, is to have government essentially as the people, not government as the government, which is what the Glorious Revolution and the Bill of Rights was putting in place. It was bringing about an authority within the government.
Do you think, Will, that it's safe to say that William Penn, knowing his history and his background and the 1670 bushel case, which was an early example of Geordie independence, annulments, that he knew when he says a right in the making of laws, that was a proper thing.
He would have known that. And of course, unfortunately, a lot of people in the establishment, and I've heard people in the freedom movement as well, making the incorrect statement that it was the 1670 bushels case that established for the first time this principle of jury independence, the idea that it's the people themselves that judge the law. No, that's not the case, for precisely the reason that you're just alluding to, which is that William Penn knew perfectly well that was already a principle in law and had been not only in 1215 Magna Carta, but going back way before that as well. And interestingly, not just in England, but all over Europe.
Common law was everywhere at that point, wasn't it? Are we talking like a couple of 100 years before Magna Carta, like Emperor Conrad?
Emperor Conrad of Germany certainly said that as well. Nisi secundum consuetudinem antecessorum nostrorum et per judicium parium suorum. And actually, if you look at that, it's almost exactly the same text as Article 39 of the 1215 Magna Carta. So you're beginning to see that actually the worldview and the ideology of James II and his mates was much closer to the raw, authentic rule of law that was framed in Magna Carta and earlier. But what the Glorious Revolution and the Bill of Rights was doing was upending it, turning it over completely, bringing about a collectivist government that was based on voting in elections through party politics. Good luck with that.
He was a firm supporter of the principles laid out in the Great Charter. So the Magna Carta 1215. And not the other versions.
Oh yes, no, it's the 1297 or the 1225 that's the real one. Yeah. It isn't real because it's the 1215. It's the binding promise on the whole governing system. That's the point, right? The whole point of a constitution is that it's there to limit the power of government so that it doesn't get beyond its rights. Its rights, but you know what I mean by the government doesn't have rights, but
Yeah.
it has limitations essentially placed on it quite deliberately. That's the point of a constitution. Yeah, and a constitution isn't legitimate if the government can write changes to that framework so that it can get out of them. You know, they wrote out Article 61, for example. Well, why would they do that?
Yeah.
You know, not that it really mattered, because Article 61 and everything that's in it, by the way, in the 1215, is implied in the rest of the Magna Carta anyway. You certainly don't put the power in the hands of the legislature to write changes to the Constitution. It's just one of the most fundamental misunderstandings of constitutional law, which is held by the mainstream. So I certainly don't expect people in the freedom movement to fall for that trap as well. Surely you cannot have a government having the right to use its legislative powers to write itself into a higher position within that constitutional framework. It literally does not make sense logically to do that. Otherwise, your constitution's no good. You might as well throw it out. The whole point of an administration in a government is to have a hierarchy because you've got to hold somebody to account. So the whole point of having the king as your head of state, in our case, is that you've got one individual to hold to account if you've got things going wrong. Now, if you've got multiple branches starting to vie for position, because what you've done is you've gaslit yourself and blurred the sense of where the authority lies. You've got a problem now because you can't ask the king to govern in his coronation oath if you've then removed a whole load of powers.
Yeah.
At least they are pretending anyway that the king's prerogative, for example, is not there. Now, my view is that the king absolutely has the right not only to remove statute on the statute book, on his statute book that he's promised to manage,
Yeah.
but he also has the right to create a piece of legislation as well, as he always did. And of course, that's what was happening around the Glorious Revolution, which everybody frames as a great thing because they think that this was a check on the king. But that wasn't the check on the king. The check on the king was trial by jury,
Yeah.
which is what happened in 1215. And they largely didn't understand this. They've kind of forgotten what is the check on the king. And the very successful check on King John was the fact that he was brought by his peers, the peers of the realm, to deal with them and basically say, you're outside your coronation oath.
Yeah.
So in order for you to carry on being king, you're going to have to re-promise again to the essentials of your coronation oath and basically say in perpetuity, in
Yeah.
forever, your government is beneath these limitations. That's the whole point of Magna Carta. That's how it was operating. But you don't go and blur that by trying to say, well, actually, let's raise the power of Parliament here, and we'll give Parliament some powers, and we'll give the king some other powers. Now you've just got a mess because you've got infighting going on. You've got the king who's been charged with the responsibility of governing in his oath, but he can't do it.
Yeah.
And the Test Act was a classic case of that.
William Penn assisted with the making of the Declaration of Indulgence and heavily promoted it. He presented it to William and Mary in the hope they would support it. William Penn described the Declaration of Indulgence as the Magna Carta of religion. He took it to William and Mary, and obviously William, he agreed on religious toleration in the sense of being able to worship, but what he wasn't going to support was repeal of the Test Act. So
Yes.
he was saying, no, we don't agree with non-Anglicans holding office.
Or go to university. I think was another one,
Yeah.
wasn't it? Be at university if you were non-Anglican.
Shared the same vision as James on religious toleration and stuck by the king through the events that transpired 1688. So he was even stuck by James during the Glorious Revolution, during the
Yes.
invasion. So he was loyal as well, and there must be a reason for that. I've got a couple of quotes I've been taken from the book that I've just started reading. If James really had the soul of a zealous bigot, one would expect a furious outburst from him as a minimum reaction to a seasonable caveat against popery. That was the pamphlet that William Penn wrote. In point of fact, there is no reason to believe that he so much as made Penn feel uncomfortable. And I just put in brackets, I just wanted to reiterate that Penn's ideas about Catholicism were mild for 17th century England. Anglicans would see Penn as a crypto-Catholic,
Even though he's a Quaker.
even though he's a Quaker, yeah.
Extraordinary.
He never defended the mistreatment of Catholics. He condemned any bloodshed and later realised he had made a mistake regarding the Popish plot. This was another quote. This affirmation would have thrust James Stewart from the Admiralty as surely as did the Test Act. Here, if ever the James of Whig history, Macaulay's vindictive tyrant should have swung into action. Indeed, a man with an ordinary amount of passion and resentment might have been expected to make some move against the client to whom he had been a generous benefactor and whom he had made welcome at the royal palace. What James did was nothing. Penn not only kept up his periodical appearances at Whitehall, but James's patronage increased instead of diminishing.
Yeah, so they were on the same page.
Historically, he, which is William Penn, denied the worst of Catholics, the charge of their loving tyranny, by pointing to Magna Carta. Even after the passage of the Test Act, he argued, we may see here that in the obscurest time of popery, they were not left without a sense of justice, and the papists, whom many think no friends to liberty and property, under dreadful penalties, enjoin an inviolable observance of this great charter by which they are confirmed.
James II is beginning to show himself as being probably hundreds of years ahead of his time, because because he is displaying this desire to be religiously tolerant and think about civil rights. And while you see, this is interesting, isn't it? Maybe he would be considered progressive and left wing. He was very forward thinking for his time, yeah, and they were not coping well with him. That's the problem.
What else is ironic is that it was the government, the English government, Parliament, that were actually aligning themselves with Louis XIV,
Yes.
in the sense not having religious toleration once he'd revoked the Edict of Nantes.
On the Edict of Nantes, I mean, so what that is for viewers is that I think it had been in place since 1598, the Edict of Nantes in France, which was basically protecting those that weren't Roman Catholic from attacks and prejudice and all the rest of it, wasn't it? Am I right in saying that?
Yeah.
But the situation was beginning to change in the late 1660s, I think, and antagonism was beginning to break out against non-Catholics. And then I think by 1676, so a little bit earlier, you were getting destruction of the Huguenot churches. So the Huguenots were non-Catholics. They Calvinists, I think they were. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, like French Protestants.
French Protestants, and so you were starting to get the destruction of churches and violence outside the stipulated areas of the Edict of Nantes, which is the protections that were in place. And then what was happening was that when did it actually take place? That they were going to take out the Edict of Nantes. So Louis XIV decided to revoke the Edict of Nantes, didn't he? Basically, to remove those protections,
Yeah.
which interestingly James was horrified about. And in fact, so yeah, so James. So here's an example. I'll just read it out. James ordered the ambassador to make sure that the English in France were well treated because you were starting to get dangerous situations for those. He
Yeah.
wrote in early 1686 to William of Orange, even this is James wrote to William of Orange, the very hard usage the Huguenots had and still have in France. It was later said that he detested Louis's conduct as not being politic, much less Christian. And in the summer of 1686, the Spanish ambassador reported how James II, he said, His Britannic Majesty declared that he abhorred the employment of jack-booted missionaries as unpolitic and unchristian. That though he wished to see his own religion embraced, he thought it contrary to Holy Writ to force consciences. So, so that
Wow.
was taken from Huguenot Heritage by R.D. Gwynn, 1985. But what that's demonstrating is that even though James began to understand that the conversions to Roman Catholicism were not real, they were coerced because
Yeah.
of the attacks on Protestants. Yeah, although he wanted people to become Catholic, he absolutely publicly declared his abhorrence for what was going on under
Yeah.
Louis reviewing that Edict of Nantes and the protections that were placed on Protestantism. So there's another example of where, and in fact, actually, James donated £500 of his own money to help the Huguenot refugees to safety in England, even though the Huguenots themselves were anti-monarchy and later proved hostile towards James's position in the Glorious Revolution.
Wow.
If that doesn't lay out the landscape of what's going on here, James II continually being knifed in the back by people that he's actually shown morality towards and compassion towards. And here
Yeah.
we've
Yeah.
got plotting and all this kind of stuff going on. It's the most appalling point in English history, actually, this.
And what people also ignore, Will, is that after the Glorious Revolution, there was actually over 70,000 Jacobites forced into exile
Yes.
into France. In 1685, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes with added measures to force conversions to Catholicism. Led to a mass exodus of the Huguenots, French Protestants into Europe. So Louis was clearly in opposition of religious toleration. So to say
Yep.
that he was aligned with James II,
Which was the claim that William III's side was making, wasn't it? And the Whigs were
yeah,
making. Oh, he's aligned with Louis. Well, actually, it was the claim was coming from the Dutch because they were worried that that England under James would become a danger to the interests of the Dutch, wasn't it?
yeah, they obviously gaslight him with the whole French English
Yeah.
alliance to obviously invade Holland.
So what we're seeing is that James was acting as a true sovereign, really. He was not taking sides either with France on things or with the Netherlands either. He's seeing the nuance in arguments and saying, I'm just sticking to my own lane here. I'm calling out immorality and wrongdoing when I
Yeah,
need to.
I think Louis wanted England to be subordinate to France.
Yes.
And I think William wanted to utilize England's resources to stop the advancement of France.
That's what it was all about, wasn't it? Really. Taking control of England and weaponize it.
Louis wanted the Pope to appoint his choice of bishops in 1682 with the help of his clerical supporters, which weren't bishops that were appointed by the Pope. the four articles were passed, meaning the king could veto the pope on ecclesiastical matters, including doctrinal statements made by the pope. It could be argued that Louis XIV wanted to establish himself as the head of the Gallican Church. If we're talking about Catholicism, then what Louis was doing was actually going against it. Although the Pope was probably recognised as the head of the church, he didn't want him to have any power. It was more like what happened with Henry VIII and the Church of England.
Definitely. Similar situation.
In 1687, Louis banned Dutch herring imports and reinstated the 1667 tariff list, which hit profitable Dutch trade. The tariff list affected the textile industry, cloth, silk, etc. That's what was going on in the background, as well as what was going on in England.
Yeah.
This was a big moment. Louis XIV seized over 100 Dutch merchant ships in French ports, increasing tensions and fears of a French invasion of Holland, and more importantly, a French-English alliance.
That
The
was the
States
problem, wasn't it?
General finally cracked and gave William the green light to invade England.
Absolutely. So this is the point, is that, the Dutch saying we want England on our side. So we're going to make sure that they're on our side, whether they like it or not.
William continuously fanned fears of an English-French alliance and brought back the memories and threat of the Anglo-Dutch War. An accusation that James II strongly contested, and which through his own actions proved later to be wrong. James wanted to remain neutral and focus on England and the issues that were developing regarding religious toleration. William, as a Dutch stadtholder, needed approval from the States General to carry out his plans. Plans were well in motion in preparation for an invasion of England. The States General had sanctioned an increase in naval ships and army personnel. William had deployed a team bound for England to scope support for his invasion and to unleash a massive propaganda operation. It was William who requested the letter of invitation in a secret meeting with Edward Russell, who was one of the Immortal Seven, to further legitimise his invasion plans, along with a declaration of reasons which also aimed to gain English support on the ground.
So yeah, just to explain that, just to make sure it's clear to the viewers that about this invitation. So we're talking about who here? We're talking about the Immortal Seven. Yeah, Lord Lumley, Henry Compton, William Cavendish, Edward Russell, Henry Sidney, Charles Talbot, of course. I've missed one out. Can't remember the other one. Anyway, they wanted change of a certain type. So they were only too happy to help in this regard.
So it wasn't actually the idea of the Immortal Seven. It was kind of, it didn't happen organically.
Yes.
What's perceived in history, what we're told in history, what's documented in history. It was actually William who requested the letter of invitation.
I'll just read this actually from Evelyn Cruikshanks. It was a skillful piece of propaganda depicting the prince, that would be William, of course, as a selfless deliverer bent only on rescuing the nation's religion, laws, and liberties from a tyrant, James II, guided by the Jesuits and Louis XIV.
William wanted to utilise England's finances, army, and navy for this war with Louis XIV and to counter the expansion of France.
I'll just read again, actually. The Dutch states and their European allies and supporters wish to bring English naval and military power to bear in a war against France, not to defend the rights of Parliament or of the Church of England.
It could be argued that William wanted to secure the succession of his wife Mary. It is more likely that it was to secure his own plans to usurp the crown, with full regal authority being vested in himself, with Mary merely being a figurehead. It seems coincidental that this is exactly what was established via the Declaration of Rights and the Bill of Rights. Parliament could have possibly planned for a republic by bypassing Mary altogether. I think in the back of his mind, he was like, well, if they do it without me and they form a republic or they have civil war and they overthrow the monarchy altogether, then Mary will be forgotten.
Yeah.
So his whole plan of trying to draw England into a war with France would disappear.
Yes.
It seems improbable that William would risk his navy and army during winter, after already being hit by terrible weather which pushed them back on the first sail, just to restore a few laws regarding religion and the continual persecution of non-Anglican dissenters. Settling the succession to the crown and dragging England into a war with France is more feasible regarding the risks William was taking.